There are evenings in London when society gathers like moths around the flame of exclusivity, drawn not by warmth, but by the irresistible allure of witnessing something rare and precious. On this particular November evening, the flame burned brightest in the drawing rooms of Lady Eugenia Harborough's Belgravia mansion, where the cream of London's cultural elite had assembled to witness the unveiling of what many considered the season's most coveted acquisition. The object of their collective fascination was deceptively modest in size, a music box no larger than a gentleman's cigar humidor, yet possessed of a provenance that could command the attention of emperors and the purses of millionaires. Lady Eugenia, resplendent in midnight blue silk that complemented her silver hair, moved through her guests with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent decades orchestrating such gatherings. Her aquiline features bore the satisfied expression of a collector who had secured not merely an object of beauty, but a triumph over her rivals. The Orpheus, as it had come to be known in the rarefied circles of musical antiquarians, sat beneath a crystal dome upon a table of inlaid tulip wood, its polished rosewood surface gleaming under the soft gaslight. Bands of chased silver encircled its modest frame, while delicate enamel work depicted the tragic myth from which it took its name, Orpheus leading Eurydice from the underworld, their figures rendered with the exquisite detail that marked the finest French craftsmanship of the 18th century. I confess that my own presence at this gathering owed more to the persistence of my friend Colonel Arbuthnot than to any particular enthusiasm for mechanical music. "Hastings, my dear fellow," he had insisted over brandy at the club, "you simply must witness this marvel. They say it belonged to Marie Antoinette herself, though I suspect such claims are made about every pretty bauble that surfaces these days." The assembled company represented a fascinating cross-section of London's most distinguished connoisseurs and, if I may say so, its most accomplished social predators. Dr. Theodore Lytton, a pale scholar whose passion for horological mechanisms bordered on the obsessive, hovered near the music box with the intensity of a lepidopterist studying a rare butterfly. His wire-rimmed spectacles reflected the gaslight as he examined the intricate mechanism, visible through a small crystal panel in the box's side. Beside him stood Barnaby Quill, the dealer through whom Lady Eugenia had acquired her prize. A compact man with the sharp features and restless energy of a fox, Quill possessed the peculiar ability to appear both obsequious and calculating simultaneously. His hands, I noticed, bore the telltale stains of someone who spent considerable time handling old metals and delicate mechanisms. The evening's entertainment was to be provided by Madame Céleste Delaunay, the celebrated French soprano whose voice had graced the opera houses of Paris and Vienna. A woman of perhaps 40 years, she retained the commanding presence that had once held audiences spellbound, though there were subtle signs that time and perhaps disappointment had begun their inexorable work. She stood near the grand pianoforte, engaged in animated conversation with Felix Harborough, Lady Eugenia's son, a young man whose considerable charm was matched only by his equally considerable debts, if the whispers were to be believed. At the piano sat Miss Iris March, Lady Eugenia's orphaned niece, a serious young woman whose musical talents had earned her a place in the household, but whose reserved manner suggested she felt more obligation than gratitude for her position. Her dark eyes held a watchfulness that seemed at odds with her 22 years, as though she had learned early to observe and catalogue the weaknesses of others. The financier, Gideon Vale, moved through the gathering with the measured steps of a man accustomed to calculating the value of everything he encountered. His elegant evening dress could not entirely disguise a certain hardness about his features, the look of someone who had made his fortune by understanding precisely when to press an advantage and when to withdraw. He paused frequently to examine various objects in Lady Eugenia's collection, his pale eyes missing nothing. Mr. Stephen March, the family solicitor, maintained his customary position near the periphery of the gathering, observing the proceedings with the professional detachment of someone paid to notice indiscretions. A thin man with prematurely grey hair, he possessed the invaluable quality of appearing simultaneously present and invisible, a skill essential to his profession. Mrs. Penrith, Lady Eugenia's companion, fluttered about the edges of conversations like a moth seeking the safety of shadows. Her nervous energy and tendency to whisper urgent nothings in her employer's ear suggested someone perpetually anxious about propriety and appearances. The composer Lionel Greaves completed our little gathering, a man whose reputation had once promised great things, but whose recent works had failed to capture either critical acclaim or popular success. He stood somewhat apart from the others, nursing a glass of wine and wearing the expression of someone who found himself present at a celebration of everything his own career had failed to achieve. As the evening progressed through the customary phases of polite conversation and careful social maneuvering, the anticipation surrounding the music box's performance grew palpable. Lady Eugenia, with the theatrical instincts of a born hostess, had timed the revelation perfectly. At precisely 9 o'clock, she called for attention with a gentle tap of her fan against her wine-glass. "My dear friends," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of absolute confidence. "You have been patient with an old woman's enthusiasm for beautiful things. Now, I believe, you shall understand why I could not resist acquiring this particular treasure, despite the considerable negotiations required to secure it." With a flourish worthy of a stage magician, she lifted the crystal dome from the music box, revealing the intricate mechanism within. The cylinder, no larger than a gentleman's thumb, gleamed with the precision of Swiss craftsmanship, while the delicate steel comb that would transform its rotation into melody caught the light like a row of tiny daggers. Dr. Lytton stepped forward with obvious reverence, producing from his waistcoat pocket a small silver key of exquisite workmanship. "The winding mechanism," he explained to the assembled company, "requires precisely 37 turns, no more, no less. The maker was most particular about such details." As he inserted the key into the star-shaped keyhole and began the careful winding process, I noticed several members of our party leaning forward with obvious anticipation. The soft clicking of the mechanism seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed drawing room, each turn building toward the moment of musical revelation. "Now," Lady Eugenia said softly, "let us hear what Orpheus has to say." Dr. Lytton opened the lid with ceremonial precision, and immediately the room filled with the most extraordinary sound I have ever heard emanate from a mechanical device. The melody that emerged was not the simple tinkling one might expect from a music box, but something far more sophisticated, a haunting air that seemed to possess an almost human quality of expression. The notes cascaded and intertwined with a complexity that suggested the hand of a master craftsman, while a subtle tremolo effect added an emotional depth that was genuinely moving. Madame Delaunay, clearly enchanted by the performance, moved to the pianoforte and began to accompany the mechanical melody with a soft vocal improvisation. Her voice, still magnificent despite the passage of years, wove around the music box's song like silk around silver wire, creating a moment of genuine beauty that transcended the merely social nature of our gathering. It was then that I first noticed the irregularity that would later prove so significant. Perhaps 2 minutes into the performance, the music box's rhythm faltered, just slightly, but enough to create a momentary discord with Madame Delaunay's accompaniment. The soprano, with the professionalism of long experience, adjusted her tempo to match, but I saw Dr. Lytton's brow furrow with concern. The performance concluded to enthusiastic applause, though I noticed that Dr. Lytton immediately moved to examine the mechanism more closely. "Most curious," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the congratulations being offered to Lady Eugenia. "The timing should be absolutely precise. There appears to be some minute irregularity in the cylinder's rotation." Gideon Vale, who had been observing the proceedings with his characteristic, calculating expression, stepped forward. "Perhaps, Dr. Lytton, you might permit me to examine the mechanism." I have some small experience with precision instruments, and I should hate for Lady Eugenia's treasure to suffer from any mechanical deficiency." Lady Eugenia nodded her consent, though I detected a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was less than entirely pleased by the suggestion that her prize might be flawed. "By all means, Mr. Vale. Dr. Lytton will supervise, and Mr. Quill may observe to ensure that any concerns about the box's condition are properly addressed." As Vale bent over the opened music box, his pale fingers hovering just above the delicate mechanism, the drawing room's gas fixtures began to flicker. At first, it was merely a brief dimming that might have been attributed to a momentary irregularity in the supply, but within moments the flickering became more pronounced. "Jenkins," Lady Eugenia called to her butler, who materialized from the doorway with the silent efficiency that marked his profession. "Please see to the gas supply immediately." But before Jenkins could respond, the lights failed entirely, plunging the drawing room into complete darkness. In the sudden blackness, I heard the sharp intake of breath that marks a room full of people caught off guard, followed by the rustle of silk and the soft scrape of chair legs against carpet as our party adjusted to their unexpected blindness. It was then, in that moment of perfect darkness, that the Orpheus began to play again, but not the haunting melody we had heard before. This time, the tune was different, lighter, almost merry in its cadence, creating an eerily inappropriate soundtrack to our predicament. The sound seemed to come from a great distance, though I knew the music box sat mere feet away. Someone cried out, a woman's voice, though I could not identify its owner in the darkness. There was a crash, the sound of something heavy striking the floor, followed by the sharp tinkle of breaking crystal. Another voice, masculine this time, uttered what I can only describe as a gasp of surprise that cut off abruptly, as though the speaker had been suddenly silenced. The music box continued its incongruously cheerful melody for perhaps 30 seconds more, before winding down to silence. In the absolute quiet that followed, I could hear nothing but the sound of our collective breathing and the faint hiss of the gas fixtures as they struggled to reignite. When the lights finally returned, flickering at first and then blazing with renewed brilliance, we were confronted with a scene that transformed our elegant gathering into something far more sinister. Gideon Vale lay crumpled beside the tulipwood table, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, one arm flung wide and the other trapped beneath him. The crystal dome that had protected the music box lay in glittering fragments across the Persian carpet, while the Orpheus itself sat askew on its table, its lid still open, its mechanism visible like an exposed heart. But it was the sight of the music box's winding key that froze the blood in my veins. The delicate silver instrument, with its scrollwork handle and star-shaped bit, protruded from the base of Vale's skull with the obscene precision of a surgical instrument. The decorative elements that had seemed so charming in Dr. Lytton's hands now appeared grotesquely inappropriate, like jewelry adorning a corpse. Dr. Lytton, his face pale as parchment, knelt beside the body with the automatic response of his medical training, though it was immediately apparent that his skills could be of no assistance. "He's dead," he announced unnecessarily, his voice barely above a whisper. "The key has been driven directly into the base of the brain. Death would have been instantaneous." Lady Eugenia, to her credit, maintained her composure with the iron discipline of her class. "Jenkins," she commanded, her voice steady despite the circumstances, "send for the police immediately, and ensure that no one leaves this room until they arrive." As Jenkins departed on his grim errand, I found myself studying the faces of our remaining party. Each bore the expression of shock appropriate to the circumstances, yet I could not shake the feeling that beneath the surface of horror and disbelief, other emotions were at work. Relief, perhaps, or satisfaction, or even fear of discovery. The Orpheus, its mechanical song now silenced, seemed to regard us with the painted eyes of its mythological figures. Orpheus and Eurydice, frozen in their eternal dance between love and loss, appeared to mock our very mortal concerns with death and guilt. The irony was not lost on me that a device created to bring beauty into the world had become an instrument of murder, its delicate mechanism transformed into something as deadly as any weapon forged for war. As we waited in that drawing room, surrounded by the elegant trappings of civilization, yet confronted with the most primitive of human acts, I could not help but think that we were in desperate need of someone who could see beyond the obvious, who could unravel the psychological complexities that had led to this moment of violence. Little did I know that such a person was already being summoned, and that before the night was over, the name of Hercule Poirot would be spoken in that room like an incantation against the darkness that had descended upon us all. The music box murder had begun, and with it, a puzzle that would test the limits of human reason and the depths of human nature. The silence that followed Dr. Lytton's grim pronouncement stretched taut as a violin string. Lady Eugenia, demonstrating the iron composure of her breeding, moved deliberately to position herself near the drawing-room entrance. "Jenkins," she commanded with crystalline authority, "no one is to leave this room until the police arrive, and send word immediately to Scotland Yard." The butler, his usual imperturbability cracked like fine porcelain, bowed stiffly. "At once, my lady." His departure left us suspended in a tableau of elegant horror. Cultured society confronted with primitive murder. Mrs. Penrith had collapsed into a corner chair, her handkerchief pressed to trembling lips. Felix Harborough stood frozen by the pianoforte, his face the color of old parchment. Madame Delaunay maintained her dignity, though her hands shook almost imperceptibly. Miss Iris March remained unnaturally still, her dark eyes cataloguing every detail with disturbing precision. "The music," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the darkness, the tune was different. That's impossible, isn't it?" Dr. Lytton's scholarly features sharpened with interest. "Quite impossible, unless someone deliberately altered the cylinder mechanism, but that would require intimate knowledge of the instrument's construction." Barnaby Quill shifted nervously. "The lever controlling the cylinder position, it's accessible beneath the lid. A practiced hand could find it even in darkness." The implications hung heavy in the gaslit air. Someone among us possessed knowledge that went far beyond casual appreciation. Heavy footsteps in the corridor announced officialdom's arrival. Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard entered with his characteristic blend of authority and practicality, his square frame filling the doorway. Behind him followed Sergeant Kemp, notebook already poised. "Lady Eugenia," Japp greeted with professional courtesy, his keen eyes immediately assessing the scene. "I understand we have a fatality." "Murder, Inspector," Lady Eugenia corrected with icy precision. "Mr. Gideon Vale has been killed with that." She indicated the silver key protruding from the victim's skull with a gesture of refined distaste. Japp approached the body with methodical care, his experienced gaze missing nothing. After a thorough examination, he straightened and addressed our assembled company. "Right then. Everyone present when the lights failed?" A chorus of affirmations met his question. "And no one left the room?" "Impossible," Lady Eugenia replied. "The darkness lasted perhaps 2 minutes. We were all here when it began, all here when it ended." Japp began his systematic questioning. Dr. Lytton explained the winding procedure, 37 precise turns, and his stepping aside when Vale requested to examine the mechanism. "The key remained in the socket," he emphasized. "Standard practice for such delicate instruments." "Where exactly were you standing when the lights failed?" Japp asked, each in turn. Felix claimed the area near the decanters. Madame Delaunay had been at the pianoforte, Iris March at the piano bench, Mr. Stephen March by the bookshelves, Lionel Greaves near the window, Mrs. Penrith hovering behind Lady Eugenia's chair, Quill beside the music box table with Dr. Lytton, and the victim was examining the mechanism when darkness fell. "Precisely," Dr. Lytton confirmed. "He was most insistent about inspecting the governor wheels." Japp's brow furrowed. This different tune Miss March mentioned. Significant? Extremely, Dr. Lytton replied. The Orpheus plays only one melody unless the cylinder is manually repositioned. In darkness, such adjustment would require someone familiar with its precise mechanism. The inspector's shrewd eyes swept our circle. Motives, then? Mr. Vale's business dealings. Any recent difficulties? An uncomfortable silence settled before Felix spoke reluctantly. He held certain notes of mine. Recent discussions had been strained. Other connections emerged under Japp's persistent questioning. Vale had pressured Lady Eugenia regarding her collection's liquidity. He'd made disparaging comments about Madame Delaunay's future prospects. His negotiations with Quill had been notoriously difficult. A man who made enemies, Japp observed grimly. As the questioning continued, I found myself increasingly convinced that this case required more than conventional police methods. The psychological complexity, the precise timing, the intimate knowledge required, all suggested a mind of exceptional cunning. Inspector, I ventured, might I suggest consulting my friend Hercule Poirot? This case possesses certain refinements that would benefit from his particular expertise. Lady Eugenia nodded approvingly. An excellent suggestion, Captain Hastings. Inspector, I should welcome the finest mind available. Japp's expression showed familiar resignation mixed with grudging respect. Very well. Sergeant, send word to Whitehaven Mansions immediately. As we waited in that elegant drawing room, surrounded by the trappings of civilization yet confronted with murder's stark reality, I reflected that we desperately needed someone who could see beyond surface appearances into the dark recesses of human motivation. The Orpheus sat silent, its painted figures frozen in eternal tragedy, keeping whatever secrets lay hidden within its mechanical heart. The distinctive sound of precise footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival we had all been anticipating with varying degrees of hope and apprehension. Hercule Poirot entered Lady Eugenia's drawing room with that peculiar combination of delicacy and authority that never failed to command attention. His immaculate evening dress, the perfect symmetry of his famous moustache, and the gleam of his patent leather shoes seemed to represent order itself entering a realm of chaos. "Eh bien," he murmured, his bright green eyes taking in the scene with one comprehensive glance. "We have here the grandeur, the culture, and the very bad taste of murder." He inclined his head courteously to Lady Eugenia. "Madame, you show admirable composure. This is good. Order and truth, they are the closest of companions." Inspector Japp stepped forward with obvious relief. "Evening, Poirot. Nasty business, this. Captain Hastings thought you might be of assistance." "Always the kindness from my good Hastings," Poirot replied warmly, touching my sleeve before moving toward the tulip-wood table with careful steps that avoided the scattered crystal fragments. I watched him straighten a fallen menu card and adjust a chair that stood askew, as though restoring physical order might clarify the mental puzzle before him. He studied the Orpheus without touching it, his head tilted at that characteristic angle of intense concentration. The key that winds the music. It becomes the instrument of death. There is a certain poetic justice in this, no? But also a practical consideration. Tell me, Dr. Lytton, this winding key, it remains always in the mechanism. Standard practice, Dr. Lytton confirmed, his scholarly features grave. Removing and replacing it repeatedly would damage the delicate socket. Précisément. So our killer does not search for a weapon. The weapon presents itself, positioned exactly where experience dictates it will be found. Poirot's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a man encountering a worthy puzzle. But observe the angle of entry, straight upward through the base of the skull. Mr. Vale was bending over the mechanism when struck. In complete darkness, the murderers must locate both victim and weapon with absolute precision. He began to pace slowly before our assembled group, his hands moving in small, precise gestures. This speaks not merely to familiarity with the music box, but to careful preparation, perhaps even rehearsal. Consider, in those moments of darkness, our killer not only commits murder but takes additional time to alter the cylinder mechanism, changing the melody. Why this additional risk? Madame Delaunay spoke with carefully controlled emotion. The tune in the darkness was different, lighter, almost mocking, as though someone wished to make a jest of death itself. Or to send a message, Iris March added quietly. Music has always been a language of emotion. Poirot paused, his expression thoughtful. Both observations show wisdom, but what message, and for whom? The psychology of this crime fascinates me. Our killer possesses not only technical knowledge, but theatrical instincts. They orchestrate not merely death, but a performance. He moved to examine the music box more closely, producing a jeweler's loop from his waistcoat. Voila! Here on the cylinder lever, these minute scratches. Fresh, very fresh. Made in darkness by fingers that knew exactly where to reach. He straightened, his gaze sweeping across each suspect's face. This level of precision suggests either exceptional familiarity or remarkable composure under pressure. Perhaps both. Felix Harborough shifted uncomfortably. Surely such accuracy would be impossible without considerable practice. But Monsieur Felix raises the essential point. Practice implies premeditation of the highest order. This murder was conceived not in passion but planned with surgical precision. Poirot's eyes glittered with intellectual excitement. Inspector Japp, I shall require private interviews with each person present. But first, if you will permit, a small experiment. He gestured for us to resume our positions from the moment of the blackout. Jenkins, please reduce the gas light to the minimum, not complete darkness, but enough to simulate the conditions. I wish to test a theory. As the room dimmed to a twilight gloom, Poirot continued. Now each of you, without moving from your place, extend your right hand toward where you believe the music box sits. Close your fingers when you judge you have reached the winding key. Hands extended tentatively through the half-light. Some reached too far, others fell short, fingers grasping uncertainly at empty air. But one hand, I will not say whose, for in that moment I could not be entirely certain, closed with the effortless precision of absolute familiarity. Poirot's eyes gleamed in the dim light. Merci. Most illuminating. As Jenkins restored full illumination, he smiled with quiet satisfaction. The little rehearsal tells me much. Now, Inspector, I shall speak privately with each suspect. 5 minutes each. It is sufficient to begin hearing the tune beneath the tune. The psychological game had begun in earnest. Poirot established his temporary headquarters in Lady Eugenia's morning room, a chamber whose leather-bound volumes and mahogany furnishings provided an atmosphere of scholarly contemplation perfectly suited to his methodical approach. Inspector Japp positioned himself discreetly in the corner while I took my customary place at Poirot's side, ready to observe the subtle psychological theater about to unfold. We shall begin with Dr. Lytton, Poirot announced, adjusting a slightly askew inkwell with characteristic precision. The gentleman whose expertise made tonight's demonstration possible. Dr. Lytton entered with the measured gait of academia, his wire-rimmed spectacles catching the lamplight. Poirot gestured courteously to the chair opposite his own. Doctor, your knowledge of the Orpheus extends beyond tonight's gathering, does it not? Indeed. Lady Eugenia permitted me to examine it yesterday afternoon for nearly 3 hours. I documented every aspect of its mechanism, a remarkable example of Junod's craftsmanship. The winding procedure, 37 turns precisely. This knowledge comes from direct experience. Lytton nodded earnestly. The maker's original specifications survive with the piece. Deviation could damage the spring mechanism irreparably. Tonight's irregularity troubled me greatly. And in darkness, Doctor, the alteration of the cylinder mechanism, this would require intimate familiarity with the lever's exact position, 1/2 inch left of the comb assembly beneath the decorative lip. Only someone who had studied the mechanism extensively could locate it with such precision. Poirot dismissed him with courteous efficiency and summoned Barnaby Quill. The dealer entered with nervous energy, his sharp features betraying anxiety beneath professional composure. "Monsieur Quill, your position near the music box when darkness fell. Most convenient for one familiar with its secrets." Quill's hands fluttered defensively. "I stood beside Dr. Lytton, yes, but I never touched the mechanism. When the crystal crashed, I stepped back instinctively." The scent of Russian leather, quite distinctive. "Your gloves, perhaps?" "A client's gift," Quill admitted reluctantly. "I often wear them when handling delicate pieces." "And Mr. Vale's examination of the mechanism, this concerned you professionally?" Gideon always questioned everything with suspicious thoroughness. He had suggested the Orpheus might not be entirely authentic, which was preposterous given my documentation. Felix Harborough followed, his youthful charm diminished by obvious strain. Poirot studied him with paternal interest, tinged by shrewd assessment. "Young man, your recent discussions with Mr. Vale regarding financial matters. These had become pressing." Felix's jaw tightened. "Nothing unusual for a gentleman of my circumstances. Vale held paper on some racing debts, but surely you don't suggest—" "Inspector Japp discovered fresh blood near the music box table," Poirot interrupted gently. "You mentioned stepping on crystal?" Felix flushed deeply. "After the lights returned, yes. I put my hand down to steady myself and caught a shard. It's nothing." "Nothing," Poirot repeated thoughtfully, noting the hastily bandaged palm. "Your childhood familiarity with music boxes? Extensive?" "Mother collected them when I was young. I learned proper winding techniques to avoid her displeasure." Iris March entered with quiet dignity, her dark eyes holding that characteristic watchfulness. Poirot softened his manner perceptibly. "Mademoiselle, your musical training provides insight into tonight's events." "I've observed Dr. Lytton winding the Orpheus many times. The mechanism fascinated me, particularly the cylinder adjustment that creates the second melody." "And Mr. Vale's behavior toward you, always appropriate?" Her composure flickered slightly. "He often made unwelcome advances, suggesting my position here was precarious. I found his presence deeply unpleasant." "In the darkness, you heard movement?" "Someone brushed past my chair, silk against wool, and there was a whisper. Now then. Nothing more." Madame Delaunay entered with theatrical dignity, intact despite circumstances. Poirot rose courteously, genuine respect evident in his manner. "Madame, your professional ear detected the irregularity in the first performance?" The timing faltered precisely 21 beats into the primary phrase. In the darkness, the second melody was La Danse Villageoise, an old country air inappropriately cheerful for such circumstances. "Mr. Vale's comments regarding your future prospects, these were known to you?" Her composure cracked slightly. "Gideon possessed a cruel tongue. He took pleasure in reminding those past their prime that beauty fades, while his money remained eternal." As each interview concluded, I observed Poirot's growing satisfaction with some private theory crystallizing in his remarkable mind. The psychological profiles were emerging with startling clarity, each suspect revealing motivations that transcended mere financial concerns. "Inspector," Poirot said finally, "we must examine the insurance documentation for the Orpheus, and have Jenkins bring me any refuse from the drawing-room grate. The little things, they often betray the great." The game of human chess had begun in earnest. Stephen March entered with the measured composure of a man accustomed to unpleasant revelations. His grey features betrayed nothing as he settled into the chair opposite Poirot, hands folded with professional precision. "Monsieur March, your legal expertise extends to insurance matters, does it not?" "Indeed. I arranged the recent policy increase on Lady Eugenia's collection. Mr. Vale had expressed particular interest in the Orpheus as collateral for certain advances." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. Advances? Lady Eugenia pledged the music box as security last week. The insurance was adjusted accordingly, with Mr. Vale named as loss payee. In the event of damage or theft, he would receive first payment. Ah, so if the Orpheus were destroyed tonight, Mr. Vale would profit handsomely. Yet it is Mr. Vale who lies dead, and the music box intact. Most curious psychology, no? March's composure flickered slightly. I merely handle the documentation, Mr. Poirot. The ironies of fate are beyond my purview. Lionel Greaves slouched into the vacated chair, his artistic pride worn thin by years of diminishing recognition. Poirot noted the ink stains on his fingers, the loosened cuff that spoke of hurried composition. Monsieur Greaves, your musical ear detected something familiar in the darkness. The second melody, La Danse Villageoise, an old country air, not commonly known. His voice carried bitter resignation. Yet you have quoted it in your own work. Greaves flushed deeply. Perhaps one draws inspiration where one finds it. Vale mocked me publicly last week, called me a spent force who pilfered peasant ditties. In the darkness, you remained stationary. Completely. But I heard someone move with purpose. Controlled breathing near the table. Not panic, execution. Mrs. Penrith fluttered in apologetically, settling at the chair's edge like a nervous sparrow. Poirot gentled his manner instinctively. Madame, the gas supply troubled you today? The pressure has been irregular. Jenkins bled the lines this afternoon, but I always ensure proper maintenance. Her handkerchief twisted anxiously. In the darkness, someone brushed past very close. My sleeve. Caught on the tulip wood table's corner. There's a tiny burr in the inlay, and I heard a whisper, now then, quite near, firm, decided. Finally, Lady Eugenia entered with regal bearing intact despite circumstances. Poirot rose with old-world courtesy. Madame, the policy increase. Your decision. Prudent business. Mr. Quill's valuation was substantial, and Mr. Vale had been pressing me regarding my collection's liquidity. He made his demands felt upon my son quite forcefully. Yet you invited him to witness your triumph? Her eyes flashed with steel. I invited society to witness that I am not to be intimidated. Mr. Vale delighted in doubt. I delight in certainty. Jenkins appeared bearing a silver tray of charred fragments from the drawing-room grate. Poirot examined each piece with his jeweler's loupe, his satisfaction evident as he reconstructed the remains. Voilà, music paper, distinguished by its ruled staves, and here, partially legible, Ah, Seville. Someone burned a fragment containing La Danse Villageoise. Why? Because this melody should not have been in their possession. He carefully preserved the evidence before turning to Inspector Japp. The practical considerations, mon ami. Japp's expression had grown increasingly granite-like. Practical says our dealer stands beside the box wearing gloves that could grip a key. Our debtor has a cut hand and motive. Our scholar knows the mechanism blindfolded, but the evidence points strongest to one man. He gestured to Sergeant Kemp. Bring in Barnaby Quill. When Quill appeared, visibly trembling, Japp's voice carried official authority. Remove your gloves, Mr. Quill. The revealed hands bore graphite traces on the fingertips, evidence of contact with the music box's governor wheels. Kemp confirmed finding fresh leather dressing on the table's underside, matching Quill's distinctive Russian leather gloves. Barnaby Quill, Japp announced with satisfaction. I'm arresting you for the murder of Gideon Vale. Quill's protests filled the air as he was led away, but Poirot remained curiously silent, his gaze inward and contemplative. When we were alone, I ventured my observation. You don't believe it's Quill? I believe, mon ami, he said softly, that we are being invited to applaud at the wrong moment. The murderer has theatrical instincts. The false crescendo, it always precedes the theme's return. His eyes gleamed with private knowledge. The hand that changed the melody also feared its memory. That is not the dealer's fear. It belongs to another entirely. As Quill's protests echoed down the corridor, Poirot remained motionless in his chair, his expression betraying none of the satisfaction one might expect from a successful arrest. Instead, his green eyes held that peculiar gleam of dissatisfaction that marked a mind encountering loose threads in what should have been a tightly woven tapestry. "Inspector Japp has his man," he murmured to me. "But I fear we have merely applauded at the intermission, thinking the performance complete." He rose with characteristic precision, adjusting his waistcoat. "Come, Hastings, we shall conduct a small experiment in human psychology." Within minutes, he had reassembled our remaining suspects in Lady Eugenia's morning room. The atmosphere had shifted palpably, no longer the shock of immediate discovery, but the tense expectancy of people who sensed they were still being hunted. "Mes amis," Poirot began with deceptive gentleness, "we shall play a little game of memory." Mrs. Penrith and Mademoiselle March both heard a whisper in the darkness. "Now then." A simple phrase, yet the voice carries character like a fingerprint. I shall ask each of you to repeat these words as you would naturally speak them. One by one they complied. Felix's aristocratic drawl made the words sound like a casual observation. Dr. Lytton's precise diction rendered them clinical. Stephen March's legal training produced clipped, professional tones. Madame Delaunay transformed them into a melodic phrase. Lionel Greaves spoke with the rougher inflections of his provincial origins. Poirot listened with the intensity of a conductor analyzing an orchestra, his head tilted at that characteristic angle. "Merci, most illuminating. The human voice, it cannot disguise itself completely, even in whispers." Lady Eugenia, who had refused to participate with aristocratic disdain, watched these proceedings with growing impatience. "Mr. Poirot, surely this theatrical display serves no purpose while the real murderer sits in custody." "Ah, but madame, that is precisely the question. Is Mr. Quill our composer, or merely a musician playing another's score?" Poirot moved to examine the charred fragments Jenkins had preserved. "Observe these burned papers. Musical notation, specifically La Danse Villageoise. Someone feared their connection to this melody becoming known." Iris March shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Mr. Poirot, I must confess something. Those fragments, they're from my own musical arrangements. I've been transcribing old folk melodies, including that particular air. When I heard it played in the darkness, I panicked and burned my original draft." The revelation sent a ripple of tension through the room. Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Your arrangements, mademoiselle, and who had access to these transcriptions?" "I kept them in the music room secretary. Anyone in the household might have seen them, but only someone with musical training would understand their significance or know how to locate the specific melody on the Orpheus cylinder." "Précisément. So our killer not only possessed intimate knowledge of the music box mechanism, but also had studied your transcriptions carefully enough to select this particular tune." Poirot's eyes gleamed with growing comprehension. The choice was not random, it was deeply personal. Felix Harborough, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke. "That melody, I've heard it before. Mother used to hum it when I was young. She said it reminded her of her childhood in the countryside." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of implication. Poirot's gaze sharpened with the intensity of a man seeing the final pieces of a complex puzzle align themselves. "Ah, now we approach the heart of the matter. The melody was chosen not as mockery, but as memory, a connection between past and present that only certain individuals would recognize." He began to pace slowly, his hands moving in small, precise gestures. "Our killer possesses not merely technical knowledge, but emotional investment. They selected this tune because it held meaning, perhaps painful meaning for someone in this room." Dr. Lytton frowned. "You're suggesting the murder was personal rather than financial?" I am suggesting, mon ami, that the strongest motives are often the oldest ones. Money is temporary, but memory endures and festers and demands satisfaction. Poirot's voice carried quiet certainty. The psychological game grows more complex. Our true killer has allowed an innocent man to be arrested while they remain free to complete their design. His eyes swept across each face with penetrating intensity. But desperation breeds carelessness. The second movement of this deadly symphony has begun, and I believe our composer cannot resist the temptation to claim credit for their artistry. The room fell silent, each person lost in private contemplation of guilt and suspicion, while Poirot smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had heard the first notes of truth's approaching melody. Poirot's words about memory's enduring power seemed to hang in the air like incense, heavy with implication. It was then that Jenkins appeared at the doorway, his customary composure finally shattered. His face bore the pallor of genuine distress as he addressed Lady Eugenia with barely controlled urgency. "My lady, I regret to report that Mrs. Penrith cannot be found. Her room is empty, her bed unslept in, and there are signs of disturbance." The announcement struck our assembled company like a physical blow. Lady Eugenia's aristocratic mask slipped for the first time that evening, revealing genuine alarm beneath her cultivated composure. "Disturbance?" Poirot inquired with sharp attention, already moving toward the door. "Elaborate, if you please, Jenkins." "The morning-room window stands open, sir, though it was securely latched when I checked the house earlier. Mrs. Penrith's writing desk has been ransacked, papers scattered, and there's this, sir." He produced a torn fragment of correspondence, the letterhead partially visible. "Derbyshire County." Poirot examined the fragment with his jeweler's loupe, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Hastings, observe the tear pattern. Not random destruction, but selective removal of specific information. Someone sought particular documents with desperate urgency." We followed him to Mrs. Penrith's modest chamber, where the evidence of struggle was unmistakable. The writing desk drawers hung open like gaping mouths, their contents strewn across the Persian carpet. But it was the open window that commanded Poirot's attention, not for what it revealed, but for what it concealed. "The sash cord has been cut," he observed, running his finger along the severed fiber. "This window is opened from within, then secured to appear as an escape route. But observe the garden below. No disturbed earth, no footprints in the frost. Mrs. Penrith did not depart through this window." Inspector Japp, summoned by the commotion, surveyed the scene with professional skepticism. "Then where is she, Poirot?" "Hidden, mon ami, hidden by someone who required her silence but lacked the stomach for a second murder." Yet, Poirot's eyes gleamed with dangerous knowledge. The correspondence fragment tells us much. Derbyshire, the county of folk songs and country dances. The county where secrets were born that refused to die. Lady Eugenia, who had followed us despite her obvious distress, suddenly swayed against the doorframe. "Mr. Poirot, there are things about my family's past. Things that Mrs. Penrith knew because she was there when they happened." "Speak freely, madame." "The time for discretion has passed." Her voice trembled with the weight of decades-old pain. "My younger sister, Eleanor. Felix's mother. She was a gifted musician with a passionate nature. Before her arranged marriage, she had a secret love affair that ended in scandal and heartbreak. The man abandoned her, leaving her devastated. La danse villageoise was her favorite melody. She would play it obsessively after he left, as though the music could somehow call him back. Felix had gone very pale. Mother always hummed that tune when she was sad. I never understood why it made her weep. And Mr. Vale's connection to this tragedy? Poirot pressed gently. Lady Eugenia's composure cracked entirely. He was the go-between, the messenger who carried promises that were never kept. After Eleanor's death, he would occasionally surface, making subtle references to what he knew. Never direct threats, he was too clever for that, but always the implication that our family's reputation remained at his mercy. Poirot nodded with grim satisfaction. So the choice of melody in the darkness was no random selection. It was a deliberate message, a cruel reminder of old wounds. But who among you would recognize its significance? Who would understand that playing La Danse Villageoise was tantamount to signing Eleanor's name to the murder? The psychological implications were staggering. The killer had not merely committed murder, they had orchestrated a symphony of revenge that reached across generations. Mrs. Penrith's disappearance was not coincidental. She was the keeper of Eleanor's secrets, the witness whose testimony could unravel carefully constructed lies. "Inspector," Poirot declared with quiet authority, "we must search this house systematically. Mrs. Penrith lives, but she is hidden somewhere within these walls. Our killer lacks the resolve for a second murder, but possesses the desperation to attempt concealment. The endgame approaches, and I fear our composer grows increasingly reckless." The music box murder had revealed its deeper purpose, not mere financial gain, but the settling of accounts written in grief and shame decades past. The systematic search of Lady Eugenia's mansion proceeded with methodical precision, Inspector Japp organizing his constables through the obvious spaces, while Poirot moved through the house with the focused intensity of a man reading an invisible manuscript. His approach differed markedly from conventional police procedure. Where others sought hiding places, he sought the psychology of concealment. "The mind that commits murder under such circumstances," he murmured as we ascended to the library, "possesses both calculation and desperation in equal measure. Mrs. Penrith was not killed because our murderer lacks the stomach for additional violence, but because her death would serve no purpose. She was hidden because her testimony threatens exposure." The library, with its towering shelves of leather-bound volumes, seemed an unlikely place for human concealment, yet Poirot paused before the section devoted to county histories with obvious interest. His trained eye detected what mine had missed, a faint disturbance in the dust patterns along one particular shelf. "Observe, Hastings, the county records of Derbyshire. This volume has been handled recently, though it appears undisturbed." He drew out the thick tome, revealing minute scratches along its spine that spoke of hurried manipulation. When he pressed against the back panel of the shelf, a soft click rewarded his efforts, and a narrow section of paneling swung inward to reveal a concealed recess. From the darkness came the faintest sound of labored breathing. Mrs. Penrith emerged into the lamplight like a figure from a nightmare, bound at wrists and ankles with strips of linen torn from household napkins, a gag fashioned from her own handkerchief, preventing speech. Her usually neat appearance was disheveled by her ordeal, but her eyes blazed with a mixture of terror and relief that spoke of unbroken spirit despite her circumstances. As Jenkins arrived with water, and I carefully loosened her restraints, Poirot examined the bindings with his characteristic attention to detail. A reef knot, competently tied, but observe the slant, Hastings. The dominant hand was the left. And here, on the edge of the recess, traces of a waxy substance with medicinal properties. I bent closer, detecting a faint, sweet scent. "Not leather dressing," I observed. "None. Something used to ease dryness of the fingers. Musicians favor such preparations, particularly those who handle string instruments." His eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he carefully preserved a minute sample. Our killer reveals themselves through the smallest details. Mrs. Penrith's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper when she had recovered sufficiently to speak. "It happened just after the interviews concluded. Someone approached me in the corridor, speaking in urgent whispers about protecting Eleanor's memory. I thought it was concern for the family's reputation, but then they produced the bindings, already prepared." "The voice, Madame. You recognized it?" "Of course. It was someone I've known for years, someone whose presence in the house seemed entirely natural. that made it more terrifying, the sudden transformation from familiar courtesy to desperate determination. They said, "Now then," in my ear, firm and decided, like a schoolmaster calling for attention. Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "And during the binding process, you observed other details?" A signet ring scratched my throat when they tightened the gag. Worn on the left hand, with an unusual setting, and there was a scent. Something sweet and medicinal, like throat lozenges. Her hand trembled as she touched her neck. They made me write a note suggesting I had fled in panic, fearing exposure of some imagined guilt regarding Mr. Vale's death. From her bodice, she produced a crumpled document that had escaped her captor's notice. Poirot unfolded it carefully, revealing a fragment of official correspondence bearing the letterhead of Derbyshire County Records. The visible text read, "Program, Midsummer Assembly, Bakewell Rooms. Featured soloist, L. Greaves, violin. Country dances to include La Danse Villageoise, The Shepherd's Daughter, and Morris variations." The implications struck our assembled company like a physical blow. Lionel Greaves, who had arrived at Japp's summons, went pale as parchment upon seeing the document. "This proves nothing," he protested with obvious desperation. "I performed in dozens of country assemblies during those years. Every musician of my generation knew those traditional airs. It was honest work when composition failed to provide adequate income." "Indeed," Poirot agreed mildly, "but the psychology of the melody choice becomes clearer. Someone selected La Danse Villageoise, not randomly, but because it held specific emotional significance. The question becomes, who among our suspects would recognize its connection to Eleanor's tragedy and use it as both weapon and signature?" He moved to examine the tulip wood table once more, producing his jeweler's loupe to study what appeared to be minor damage to the inlay. Mrs. Penrith mentioned her sleeve catching on a burr in the wood surface. "But observe, this is not accidental damage. These are fresh scratches, made by something metallic scraping against the delicate marquetry." His examination revealed minute fibers caught in the damaged wood, silk threads of an unusual weave and distinctive deep blue color. "Expensive fabric, Hastings. Not the common silk of ready-made garments, but something bespoke, something that speaks of refined taste and considerable means." The physical evidence was mounting with inexorable precision, each detail adding another note to the symphony of guilt that Poirot was orchestrating. Yet he revealed nothing of his conclusions, merely smiled with quiet satisfaction as he carefully preserved each clue. "Inspector Japp," he announced finally, "you will release Mr. Quill immediately. He is innocent of murder, whatever his other failings might be. Our true killer possesses not only intimate knowledge of the Orpheus mechanism, but deep emotional connections to the melody they chose as their signature." The psychological profile grows clearer with each revelation. As Mrs. Penrith was helped to her chambers and the physical evidence secured, I sensed that Poirot had discovered something crucial, some hidden detail that would prove decisive in exposing the murderer's identity. His manner carried the quiet confidence of a man who had heard the first notes of truth's approaching melody, though he kept his own counsel regarding the final revelation that would bring this deadly symphony to its conclusion. The music box murder was approaching its crescendo, and I knew that Hercule Poirot held all the instruments necessary to conduct its final, devastating movement. The discovery of Mrs. Penrith's ordeal had transformed the atmosphere in Lady Eugenia's mansion from shocked bewilderment to something far more sinister, the recognition that we harbored not merely a murderer, but someone capable of elaborate psychological manipulation. As the household settled into an uneasy quiet, Poirot requested that we reassemble in the drawing room for what he termed a small experiment in human observation. The Orpheus sat once more upon its tulip wood table, the crystal dome restored to its protective position. The gas fixtures had been adjusted to cast a softer light, creating pools of shadow that seemed to shift and breathe with our collective tension. Poirot moved through the space with his characteristic precision, adjusting a chair here, straightening a picture frame there, as though the physical order of the room might somehow clarify the mental disorder we faced. "Mes amis," he began, his voice carrying that deceptive gentleness that masked razor-sharp perception. "We have learned much tonight about the psychology of our killer. They possess not merely technical knowledge, but emotional investment. They chose their weapon not from necessity, but from symbolic appropriateness. The very key that brings music to life became the instrument of death." He paused before the music box, his hands clasped behind his back in contemplation. "Consider the evidence we have gathered, each piece a note in a symphony of guilt. The left-handed knots that bound Mrs. Penrith, executed with the confidence of long practice. The medicinal preparation detected on the binding materials, suggesting someone whose hands require regular care from intensive use. The whisper heard in the darkness. Now then, spoken with the authority of someone accustomed to command. Lady Eugenia, maintaining her aristocratic composure despite the obvious strain, watched Poirot with calculating eyes. Felix shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his bandaged hand a stark reminder of the evening's violence. Iris March sat with her customary watchfulness, her dark eyes following Poirot's every movement with disturbing intensity. "But it is the silk threads that fascinate me most," Poirot continued, producing the evidence with theatrical precision. "Not common silk, but fabric of exceptional quality. Deep blue, with a weave that speaks of considerable expense and refined taste. These threads were caught on the tulip wood table's damaged inlay, torn away during the struggle in darkness." He moved closer to our assembled group, his green eyes studying each face with penetrating intensity. "The killer wore gloves during the murder itself. We know this from the lack of fingerprints on the winding key. Yet somehow, silk fibers were deposited at the scene. This suggests that the outer garment, perhaps a sleeve or cuff, made contact with the table's edge during the violent struggle." Dr. Lytton leaned forward with scholarly interest. The precision required to locate both victim and weapon in complete darkness suggests extensive familiarity with the mechanism's placement. "Précisément, mon ami. But observe the deeper psychology at work. Our killer selected La Danse Villageoise, not randomly, but because it carried specific emotional significance. This melody was Eleanor Harborough's favorite, the tune she played obsessively after her heart was broken by promises that were never kept. The mention of Eleanor's name sent a visible ripple through our gathering. Lady Eugenia's mask of composure flickered momentarily, while Felix's face grew pale with recognition. Mrs. Penrith, despite her ordeal, had insisted on rejoining us, and she nodded with grim confirmation. "Mr. Vale's role in that ancient tragedy has become clear," Poirot continued relentlessly. "He was the messenger who carried false promises, the go-between who enabled a cruel deception that ultimately destroyed a young woman's life. For 30 years, he has profited from that knowledge, using it as a weapon of subtle intimidation against this family." He began to pace slowly, his hands moving in small, precise gestures. Tonight's murder was not merely revenge, it was a statement. The killer wished not only to end Vale's life, but to do so in a manner that would evoke Eleanor's memory. The choice of melody was as important as the choice of weapon. The psychological portrait was becoming increasingly clear, yet Poirot revealed nothing of his final conclusions. Instead, he moved to examine the music box one more time, his jeweler's loupe revealing details invisible to ordinary observation. The cylinder adjustment mechanism bears fresh scratches, not from tools, but from fingernails gripping with desperate intensity. This speaks to emotional involvement beyond mere calculation. Our killer was not cold-blooded, but passionate, driven by feelings that had festered for decades. Inspector Japp, who had been listening with growing impatience, finally spoke. "All very well, Poirot, but when do we name our murderer?" Poirot smiled with quiet satisfaction, his eyes gleaming with private knowledge. Patience, mon ami. The final movement of this deadly symphony requires perfect timing. I've identified our killer through the convergence of physical evidence, psychological analysis, and human nature itself. But the revelation must come at precisely the right moment for maximum effect. He moved to the window, gazing out at the London fog that had begun to creep through the streets like a living thing. Tomorrow morning we shall gather once more in this room. I shall then demonstrate not merely who committed this crime, but how every detail was orchestrated to create the perfect murder. The psychology of guilt, the mechanics of deception, and the poetry of revenge, all shall be revealed. The room fell silent, each person lost in private contemplation of guilt and fear. The Orpheus sat motionless beneath its crystal dome, its painted figures frozen in eternal tragedy, keeping whatever secrets lay hidden within its mechanical heart. As we prepared to retire for what promised to be a sleepless night, I caught Poirot's eye and saw there the quiet confidence of a man who had solved the puzzle completely. The music box murder was approaching its crescendo, and Hercule Poirot held all the instruments necessary to conduct its final, devastating movement. The truth would have its symphony, and justice would have its due. The morning light filtered through Lady Eugenia's drawing-room windows with the pale quality of November sun, casting long shadows across the scene where tragedy had unfolded mere hours before. The Orpheus sat beneath its restored crystal dome, somehow diminished by the violence it had witnessed, as though beauty itself had been tainted by murder's touch. One by one, our suspects filed into the room with the reluctant precision of actors summoned for a performance they would rather avoid. Poirot had positioned himself near the tulip-wood table, his immaculate morning dress and perfectly waxed moustache presenting their usual image of fastidious order. Yet there was something different in his manner today, a quality of contained energy that suggested a mind prepared to reveal its most carefully guarded secrets. Inspector Japp stood at attention near the doorway, while I took my customary position where I might observe both Poirot's performance and our suspect's reactions. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "We gather this morning to witness the conclusion of a symphony that began not last evening, but 30 years ago. The murder of Gideon Vale was merely the final movement of a composition written in grief, orchestrated in shame, and performed with the precision of long-rehearsed hatred." He moved to the music box, his hands hovering above its surface without quite touching the mechanism. "Let us begin with the physical evidence, for it speaks with eloquent clarity." Our killer possessed intimate knowledge of the Orpheus. Not merely its winding procedure, but the exact location of the cylinder adjustment mechanism that would allow them to change melodies in complete darkness. This knowledge came not from casual observation, but from extensive familiarity. Poirot produced the silk threads with theatrical precision. These exquisite fibers, deep blue and of distinctive weave, were caught on the table's damaged inlay during the struggle. They speak of expensive fabric, not ready-made, but bespoke tailoring of the highest quality. He continued his methodical presentation. The left-handed knots that bound Mrs. Penrith executed with the confidence of long practice. The medicinal preparation detected on the binding materials, a substance used by those whose hands require regular care from delicate work. The signet ring that marked Mrs. Penrith's throat, worn on the left hand with a distinctive crest. But it is the psychological evidence that reveals our killer's true nature, Poirot continued, beginning his characteristic pace. The selection of La Danse Villageoise was not random. It was deeply personal, chosen because it evoked specific memories of Eleanor Harborough's tragedy. Only someone intimately connected to that ancient heartbreak would understand the cruel poetry of using her favorite melody as a signature for murder. Mrs. Penrith, despite her ordeal, spoke with quiet certainty. The voice in the darkness. "I've had all night to consider it. The whisper of "now then" was spoken with an authority I recognized, but in circumstances so unexpected that I initially dismissed the implications. "Precisely, madame," Poirot nodded. "The human voice cannot disguise itself completely. The inflection, the rhythm, the unconscious mannerisms of command, all reveal character like fingerprints of the soul." Poirot's green eyes swept across our assembled group with penetrating intensity. "Consider what our killer required. Intimate knowledge of the music box mechanism, the authority to command obedience even in desperate circumstances, access to Eleanor's private history, and the emotional investment to orchestrate such elaborate revenge." He paused before each suspect in turn. Dr. Lytton possessed the technical knowledge but lacked personal connection to Eleanor's tragedy. Felix Harborough had motive regarding his debts, but insufficient familiarity with the mechanism's precise operation. Iris March understood the musical elements, but had no reason for such elaborate vengeance. Lionel Greaves knew the melody from his performing days, but lacked the household authority our crime required. The tension in the room had become palpable, each person holding their breath as though afraid that the slightest sound might precipitate the final revelation. Poirot stopped directly before Lady Eugenia, his gaze meeting hers with unwavering intensity. "Madame, you alone possessed every element necessary for this crime. You had the deepest motive, a sister's love transformed into 30 years of hatred for the man who destroyed Eleanor's life. You had the knowledge, as mistress of this house, you were intimately familiar with every detail of your prized collection, including the precise mechanism of the Orpheus." Lady Eugenia's aristocratic composure began to show hairline cracks, like fine porcelain under pressure. "You had the authority," Poirot continued relentlessly. "When you whispered, 'now then,' to Mrs. Penrith, she obeyed instinctively, the response of a companion to her mistress of many years. You had the access to Eleanor's private papers, to the knowledge of which melody would carry the cruelest message, and you had the skill, your hands, once celebrated for their musical dexterity, retained the strength and precision necessary for both murder and the delicate manipulation of the cylinder mechanism." He produced the physical evidence with devastating precision. "The silk threads match your evening gown exactly. Deep blue bespoke fabric of exceptional quality. The left-handed knots correspond to your dominant hand, a detail known to your household staff. The medicinal preparation matches the hand cream you use to maintain the suppleness required for your private musical practice. And most damning of all, the signet ring bearing the Harborough crest that marked Mrs. Penrith's throat." The room fell into absolute silence, the morning light seeming to dim as the full weight of Poirot's accusation settled upon us all. Lady Eugenia sat perfectly still for a long moment, her mask of aristocratic composure finally beginning to crumble. When she spoke, her voice carried the cold authority of absolute conviction. "He deserved to die for what he did to Eleanor. He deserved to hear her song as he departed this world." Her eyes blazed with a fierce, almost triumphant light. "For 30 years, I watched him profit from my sister's destruction, using his knowledge like a blade held perpetually at our family's throat." She rose with regal dignity intact despite her confession. "I regret only that his death was too quick, too merciful for the decades of suffering he caused. Eleanor died of a broken heart because of his lies and Vale's greed. Justice demanded a reckoning." Inspector Japp stepped forward with professional gravity. "Lady Eugenia Harborough, I arrest you for the murder of Gideon Vale." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Poirot moved to restore the crystal dome over the Orpheus with delicate fingers. "You chose music to wound a ghost, madame," he said softly. "But ghosts do not die quietly. It is the living who must answer for the songs they choose to play." The music box murder had reached its final, devastating crescendo, and justice had found its voice in the most unexpected of instruments. A sister's love transformed into an agent of perfectly orchestrated revenge. The drawing room seemed to exhale a long, shuddering breath as Lady Eugenia was led away, her aristocratic bearing intact even in defeat. The handcuffs clicked with metallic finality, yet her eyes held not shame but a distant satisfaction, as though a burden carried for 3 decades had finally been lifted. "For Eleanor," she murmured as Inspector Japp's men escorted her past the threshold. It was always for Eleanor. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Felix's sharp intake of breath as he collapsed into the nearest chair. His youthful features, already marked by the evening's revelations, now bore the additional weight of family shame and tragic understanding. Mrs. Penrith, despite her recent ordeal, moved to comfort him with maternal instincts that transcended her own suffering. Poirot remained beside the Orpheus, his hands clasped contemplatively as he observed the human aftermath of his methodical revelation. "The psychology of revenge," he murmured to me as the others processed their shock. "It consumes the avenger as surely as the victim. Lady Eugenia lived 30 years with hatred as her closest companion, nurturing it like a poisonous flower until it bloomed into perfect murder." Inspector Japp, preparing to depart with his prisoner, paused to address the lingering questions. Remarkable how all those small details pointed to one person, Poirot. The silk threads, the left-handed knots, that distinctive ring mark on Mrs. Penrith's throat. "Précisément, mon ami." Each element seemed insignificant in isolation, yet woven together, they created an unbreakable net of proof. Poirot moved to the music box, adjusting its position with characteristic precision. "Observe the deeper pattern. Every aspect of this crime was chosen for emotional resonance rather than mere practicality. The winding key as weapon, the melody as message, the darkness as theatrical concealment. Lady Eugenia created not simply murder, but performance art dedicated to her sister's memory." Dr. Lytton, his scholarly fascination undimmed by the evening's horrors, approached the mechanism one final time. The cylinder adjustment in complete darkness, such precision required intimate familiarity born of obsessive practice. Indeed, Lady Eugenia had rehearsed this moment countless times in private until her hands could locate every component without sight. The fresh scratches on the adjustment lever told their own story, fingernails gripping with desperate intensity, not the controlled movements of casual examination. Felix looked up with haunted eyes. "She never spoke of Mother's past. If I had known the truth about Vale's role in Eleanor's destruction—" "She believed silence to be protection," Poirot replied gently. "And perhaps for many years it was. But silence ferments within the heart, becoming the most dangerous of spirits. Your aunt transformed love into hatred, preserving it across decades until it achieved this terrible flowering." Mrs. Penrith found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. The whisper in the darkness. "Now then, I should have recognized the authority immediately. 30 years of service creates instinctive obedience, even in the most unexpected circumstances. The human voice cannot disguise itself completely, madame. Inflection, rhythm, the unconscious mannerisms of command, all reveal character like fingerprints of the soul." As the household staff began their melancholy restoration, removing physical traces while leaving emotional scars untouched, I contemplated the strange justice of the evening's events. "The music box provided perfect symbolic retribution," I observed. "Ah, but consider the deeper irony, Hastings. The Orpheus was created to preserve beauty across time, yet Lady Eugenia used it to preserve hatred across decades. She transformed the mythological song of love into a requiem for revenge." Poirot's expression mixed admiration with profound sadness. The ancient Greeks understood music's dual nature. It could heal souls or destroy them, depending upon the performer's intentions. As we prepared to depart, Poirot paused for one last contemplation of the scene. The morning light fell differently now across the elegant furnishings, as though truth's revelation had somehow altered the very quality of illumination. "She created a perfect crime in every detail save one," he observed. "She could not resist the artistic flourish that revealed her identity. The melody was her signature, as distinctive as any painter's brushstroke. Our carriage pulled away from Belgravia toward the familiar comfort of Whitehaven mansions, leaving behind a mansion where the echoes of murder would linger long after the physical evidence disappeared. The fog was lifting from London's streets, revealing the familiar landmarks of civilization restored to proper order. "Do you believe she feels remorse?" I asked. Poirot considered this carefully. "She feels completion, mon ami. For the first time in 3 decades, Lady Eugenia sleeps without hatred as her bedtime companion. In her mind, she has finally honored Eleanor's memory with appropriate tribute." As we reached our destination, he straightened his tie with mechanical precision. "Remember this case well, Hastings. The most elaborate murders are often the most personal ones. Lady Eugenia killed not for money or passion, but for poetry. That makes her both the most dangerous and most tragic of criminals." The music box murder had ended, its haunting melody forever silenced, yet echoing in memory, as a reminder that even the most beautiful instruments can become weapons when wielded by hands, guided by hatred rather than love.